Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. Just a couple of preliminary comments. One, no web surfing during the talk. So I've had the privilege of sitting in the back, so I want to make sure that, you know, as in my own classes, my students are invited to leave if they're surfing the web on their computers. Secondly, as Merrick suggested, although the basis of the talk is Gibson's ecological psychology, the phrase ecological psychology is a source of some confusion because there are in fact 3 different psychologists in the United States who've used that phrase to describe their work. And those can be easily mixed up. You know, one of them is Gibson, another is Roger Barker, who I will talk about a little bit, although I'm going to be mounting Barker's ideas on a Gibsonian foundation, which I take from some Barkarians has been okay with them. And then there's Yuri Bronfenbrenner's work, who also describes his work as ecological psychology, and I'm not going to be talking about that at all. So sometimes that phrase is misleading because you read it and you don't know which position we're talking about. Unfortunately, although they knew one another, they never got together to straighten out who was going to use which term. Secondly, my apologies in advance if I misinterpret any of the views of enaction theorists. I'm not new to enaction theory. I mean, I've been reading about it periodically over the years. I read the Varela, Thompson and Roche book when it came out, but I haven't been keeping up with it. It's only been in the last 2 weeks that I've sort of done a crash course. So there may be some things I say that are incorrect, and please excuse that. Also, in that regard, one of my major goals is to make sure that Gibson's understood properly, or the ecological approach is understood properly. And I'm not here to convince you that this is a good way to go. I just want you to reject it on the grounds in which it is offering, rather than on some other grounds which it isn't pretending to offer. The other difference, I think, is that Gibson's goals were more modest than what I gather most enaction theorists. Gibson was primarily trying to develop a theory of perception, not a philosophy of life, not an approach to life overall. He certainly thought that his views about perception could be the basis for thinking about other things, like other forms of cognition other than perception. But primarily, he's focusing on perception and principally visual perception, although not solely. Let me add, I said, phrase something in a particular way a moment ago, and let me go back to that. I'm not going to be drawing a distinction between perception and cognition. Rather, perception is a form of cognition. The term cognition just refers to various ways of coming to know, and perceiving is one of those ways. And there are other ways which don't involve perceiving, although I would like to think they're built on a foundation of perceiving. And then the other thing which I think is really great is that as I look over some of the literature of enaction theory, the overlap between it and ecological psychology is great. So that means the differences are small and they're interesting, and we can really squabble over them. So we don't have to sort of deal with some of the fundamental assumptions, which I think we share. I guess the way I just want to start out is a phrase that's been used a bit over the last couple of days, in that there have been some diagrams where we have the organism, and we're talking about the organism as having autonomy, and then there's this bigger box around it, and the phrase is often used, everything else, okay? I'm interested in everything else. Or more specifically, the focus that I want to take is not beginning with the organism, okay, but rather beginning with the organism environment relationship, which is a dynamic relationship. So let me begin by giving you an outline of where I'm going to go. I tried to find something appropriate. I gather this is the golf resort in the early moment of construction. I'm not quite sure. But here's roughly the outline, and it's going to hop a little bit, but so at least you'll know. First of all, I'm going to talk about some principles of ecological psychology, and I want to contrast it to picture perception, not so much because I think you subscribe to this, but rather I think there are some issues about the differences between picture perception and environmental perception which get dicey between the two views. And then I want to illustrate some of these points with some research of mine on navigation. Then I'll move to the concept of affordances, which is, of course, probably gotten more attention than outside of ecological psychology than anything else. And at that point, I'm going to move into the positions that I've developed somewhat not independent, but as an extension of the Gibsonian. So kind of up to here, I'm going to be doing chapter and verse of ecological psychology, which most folks that I associate with would agree, but then basically move into how I've pushed the field a little bit, and that'll be talking about cultural historical processes. Then the last 2 points is I want to root this theoretical position in a philosophical foundation. This has been a problem. One of the major goals of my book was to try to do just that. Many people read Gibson and they think, well, these are interesting ideas, but they don't fit into anything I've ever seen before. Where do they come from? So what I want to do is, in a very brief period of time, try to then embed ecological psychology into a philosophical foundation, and that will be William James's radical empiricism. And then lastly, to kind of create some fodder for discussion, I want to say a few things about inaction, and particularly inactive approaches to perception and ecological psychology, and how I think they're different. And that may give us some things to throw around. Okay, so let me start. As I said, I want to start with everything else. And so that means I want to start with the environment. So I'm going to just sort of follow the way that Gibson sort of introduces his last book. What's remarkable about his last book, if you've not seen it, his book is called The Ecological Approach to Perception. But you don't get to anything about the organism until you're halfway through the book. The entire first half of the book is about the environment, which is kind of peculiar. Most books on perception and psychology begin, with the receptors and perhaps a physical analysis of stimulation, but the receptors come early, the brain comes early. Gibson's going to deal with the perceiver pretty late. So let's first talk about the environment. By the way, I noticed just that as your steering wheels are on the wrong side of the car for me, it turns out your toggle switches are reversed. So I may be going backwards when I want to go forwards on this. So let's see. So what are some of the principles, what are some of the things we need to know about environments? First, environments surround and are extended. That is to say, if we have an organism situated in an environment is extended and surrounds the individual. And this is the case. This is a ubiquitous property of environments. The second property of environments is that they are structured. That is to say, they're not amorphous. There's variation. We can spend a lot of time talking about these structures. Certainly there are textures, there's objects, there's horizon, there's an intrinsic up and down. And there's a nesting of properties, we have sort of smaller structures nested within larger structures and so on. So, and again, this is true of any environment, including the one we're in. Okay, so the person situated in an environment, the environment is extended and it surrounds the individual, the environment has structure. Now let's talk about the organism. I'm jumping ahead now. Now, this is, Gibson considers these three terms kind of critical to his theory, substances, surfaces, and medium. Okay, so first of all, the environment consists of matter, material substances, and substances has surfaces, and a surface is a boundary between an object and a medium. In this case, you can see that the surface is adjacent to a water medium, but also a surface of an object can interface with the air as a medium. And so in the case of vision, we have a source of light which interacts with surfaces. And critically, the light is affected by, is structured by the character of the surface in terms of its texture, in terms of its color, in terms of its orientation relative to the light. So what we're concerned about here is not so much the light from the light source, but rather light that's reflected off of surfaces. So for example, and this I apologize. This isn't, if I was more skilled at PowerPoint, you might be able to see this a little better. But the idea is what we're interested in is the way in which light is reflected off of surfaces and fills the local environment with reflected light. The reflected light is going to be structured with reference to the surfaces that it reflects from. Again, in terms of carrying information about texture, color, orientation, shape, and so on. Oh yeah, and we could, although light is reflected in all directions, we could put a perceiver at any place in that environment. And in this case, just an eye. It's not adequate view of a perceiver. It's only part of a perceiver, obviously. And then that perceiver will be in a position to begin to sample the ambient structured light. And if you have any questions or clarification, please raise them. Matters of debate, I'd rather save until the end. John?
Who's studying all these things about the environment? You God?
I'm sorry, who is
studying all these things about the environment? You God?
Me, God. Yeah, I tend not to think about myself in that way. We know a lot. We know about a lot about light and how light interacts with surfaces. And so if we think about the environment for the moment, independent of the organism, we can begin to describe how light interacts with the features of the environment.
Independent of the organism. I mean,
I'm sorry?
It's not independent of the organism.
What
you're saying that it's independent of the organism is a reification of the knowledge that human scientists, physicists in particular, developed.
What I said was...
That's not organism independent.
You didn't hear what I said then, because I said for the moment we're looking at the environment independent of the organism. We're going to talk about an organism-environment system, but we're going to first take the environment as the figure and the organism as the ground, and then we're going to flip it in just a minute. It must be, I guess, let me just follow up that point with something else. What in traditional approaches to perception, again, if we're looking at the information for perceiving, typically it's described in terms of physical variables, like wavelengths of light, for example, or wavelengths intensity of sound. What's going on here is an attempt to develop an account of the physics of the situation, not in terms of the sources of energy, but rather how the sources of energy interact with environmental surfaces. So what's going on is an attempt to develop something that we could call ecological physics, okay? And specifically what I'm talking about here is something that we'll call ecological optics, as opposed to optics, okay? Optics refers to how light interacts with lenses. Ecological optics refers to how light interacts with surfaces. And we can talk about how light interacts with lenses independent of people, and that doesn't mean we have a God's eye view. We're just carving out a part of the world. Okay, then turning to the organism, what we know about organisms, as you all well know, is that organisms are active, they're mobile, and if we put these two pieces together, if we have environments that extend and surround and that are structured, and we have organisms that are mobile, then what they're going to need are ways of guiding themselves through this structured world. So perceiving, fundamentally, is a process that enables organisms to better move through the environment. Sometimes, as in the case of the earthworm, the detection is of a very proximal environment. Other times, in the case of other organisms, such as us, we're detecting properties at a greater distance. But the point is that on the one hand, perceiving operates in the service of action. That is to say, we perceive in order to help us better move around, get resources, and so on. It's a functional account of why perceiving exists. And so you can see that perceiving is guiding the actions of these two individuals, these two children. Being able to see the cliff edge or the visual cliff enables the child to avoid falling off. Okay, so perceiving has a very functional role. And notice that I'm not talking about perceiving an action necessarily, as you'll see, as two different processes, but really as a synergistic processes, because in fact we can reverse that and we can say that not only does perceiving support action, but action also supports perceiving. And why is that the case? Because it's really pretty easy to demonstrate that if you grab an object and don't move your hand with respect to its surfaces, it's often very hard to identify what it is you're holding on to. But if you move your hand relative to the surfaces, it's quite easy to identify what you're holding on to. So action supports perceiving, even as perceiving supports action. So here we have the case of a physician, palpating a patient. I mean, you may notice that your physician doesn't just kind of place his or her hand on your skin and leave it there as if they're healers. They're pushing and prodding and probing. What they're trying to do is get information. They're trying to understand about what structures they're confronted with the patient. And in fact, people are very keen on allowing, having experiences where actions reveal structures. Now, let me talk a bit about what action, one of the things that action provides for perceiving. This is an experiment done with young infants, and what they're shown is an object in different axes. Okay, and what the baby's in a car seat, and it travels around this arc, looking at this object, and what it gets is these various transformations of the object. In this case, it's oriented on a different axis, and so on. Two different objects, and the question that's of interest here is, what is the baby perceiving? Now, this is a terribly difficult question to ask, obviously, because babies won't tell you what they're perceiving. The standard procedure, which is not without some criticism, is the habituation paradigm, which many of you know about. So if the basic idea of the habituation paradigm is the babies will continue to look at something until and then will lose interest. Then you show them something else. If they show no interest in the second thing, the presumption is they see the second thing as being similar to the first thing. If they suddenly, if it gets their attention, then presumably they see it as somehow different. So the question is, do babies perceive these different projective presentations as being different projections? And this is important for enaction theory in terms of the enaction theory perception. Or do they perceive it as an object that's a single object that's perceived from different points of view? In other words, do they detect the object with regard to an invariant structure? An invariant structure is structure that is constant across changes of orientation in this case. Okay. So to perceive an object is to perceive its invariant structure, meaning that you can recognize it from any position. And now we can sort of we can get back into why action plays a role here, because action enables you to engage the object from different angles in different ways so that you can extract the invariant. Yeah?
Sorry, one clarification. So the baby's in control of that?
No.
So it's not action?
We're just getting different viewpoints. We're just getting different viewpoints. Right. Right. And which is why this is actually interesting, because this baby's not had prior experience, well, other than being carried around by its mother perhaps, has not had experience, had limited experience, but through exposure it can presumably detect something that's common across all the viewpoints. I'm going on a little sleep, so my words will sometimes elude me.
So what is the result of this study? Like a baby?
Yeah, oh yes, yeah, and yes, so the baby has no, if you present then the object from a certain particular point of view and the baby habituates to it, you change the orientation, the baby still, it doesn't dishabituate. In other words, it recognizes, and as best as we can tell, it recognizes the object independent of any particular viewing position. In other words, what it's done, presumably, and I'll try to be clearer about the notion of invariant as I go, is that it's detected a property that is common across varying viewing positions. In other words, it doesn't perceive a projection. Now, an important point here, which I'll come to in a minute, this suggests that the notion of perceiving as being based on a retinal image, it makes no sense at all. Because the retinal image, of course, are projected projections of an object, a two-dimensional projection, and this is exactly what the baby appears not to be doing.
Can I just ask you again for clarification? You said an invariant property, but you didn't say what it's a property of. So an invariant property of the object, an invariant property of the object-child relation, an invariant property of the environment. What's an invariant?
It's an invariant property of the object, but to anticipate the next point, but that's available to a perceiver, to a moving perceiver. So, I mean, in other words, the invariant isn't just, and this will be important for our differences or agreements or discussion, is the invariant isn't just sitting out there. It's something that is revealed through action. But it's revealed, but what's revealed is a property of the object. So give me, well, I'll come back to that, I promise.
But it's not like the baby's not moving. The baby's eyes are moving. So it's not that there's no movement, that it's baby's eyes.
Yeah, but with respect to...
Yeah, but if they're not...
But the eyes don't really change the visual angle very much.
Well, but it's a little bit like the detecting, so you need to vary, to detect the invariance of the object, you vary, you saccade.
It isn't the saccades that make a difference, because the saccades, you're not changing your viewing position when you have saccadic movement. I'm talking about literally moving to another viewing position, even a little. And I'll show you some evidence for that later on. But again, if you have any doubts about this, I demonstrate this with my introductory psychology class. I mean, just pick a friend and find some common objects and then tell them to close their eyes and put the object in their hand and tell them not to move their hand and ask them to identify the object. They're going to have a hard time. Ask them to move it around and it is easy. What's the difference between those two cases? By moving the object in your hand, what you're doing is you're detecting invariant properties of the object through action.
Yeah, but I would say that's very different from the baby, because also if you move an object across somebody else's hand,
Yeah.
it's also difficult for the person to identify.
Yeah.
Whereas here you're moving the baby around in space. I also wanted to ask what age are they?
Yeah, my memory's crummy, but we're talking about on the order of 3 to 4 weeks. You're right, but not completely. It turns out that self-produced action does reveal more information, and I'll try to show you why. But you don't necessarily have to have self-produced action. You can also have passive movement.
I would say in the baby case, that's not actually active perception, but it's multisensory in terms of vestibular, visual invariance or something like that.
Well, vestibular information gives you no information about that, and there's no efference going on because the baby's not doing anything except engaging in saccades.
But then I wouldn't say it's sensory motor.
I'd ever use the word sensory motor. Yeah, and in fact, I'm never going to use the phrase sensory motor. In fact, I think the notion of sensory is dead wrong. Okay, but I'll come back to that. Okay, so if we now, instead of conveying a baby around in an arc, we have a person who can move around. What the person is able to do is sort of adopt different vantage points in the ambient optic array and actually create transformations in the ambient optic array. And here is, since I don't have the talents of doing any animation, this is a poor man's animation. Whoops, to Why is this just going on and on? Oh, sorry, this is my left-right problem here. Okay. So as we move, it's essentially what that moving perceiver is doing is essentially what you do when you move an object in your hand. But in this case, the body is moving in the world and creating, and this is key, transformations in the optic array which enable invariants to be separated or detected in the array. In other words, it's not that you're perceiving something that's static. You need to introduce change in order to reveal what's constant. Transformations, like invariants are revealed through transformations. And for that reason, invariants are not frozen in time. They're only revealed over time, and I can't emphasize that enough. Okay? That is to say, so I'll say it again, that invariants are not these frozen source, let's say, basis of information, but rather they're only revealed over time, and they're revealed over time because the perceiver produces transformations through movements of the body which reveal invariance. So it's a fully dynamic process, although Gibson didn't use that terminology. Okay, so what have I said so far? Quick summary. I said that environments surround and are extended, organisms are mobile, and that we develop sensitivities, receptor sensitivities that guide movement. In some cases only eye spots, vibration detectors, chemical receptors, and so on, but they develop in the service of action, and reciprocally action facilitates perceiving. Action reveals structure, and perceiving is the detection of structure over time. So let me slow down on these last 2 points. Perceiving is the detection of structure over time, and this is going to be a crucial difference between sensation and perception, because sensations, as classically defined, do not vary over time. They're patches of light, they're pinpoints of sound, bits of sound. So they do not support perception, but I'll come back to that. The next point, which has kind of been implicit in what I've just said, but I want to emphasize it, because I think this is a place when I read the Enaction literature where Gibson's misunderstood frequently. There's this notion that there seems to be this expression that information is out there in the environment. And in a sense it is, but not completely, because in fact information is revealed through action. Information is relational, and I'll show you a couple of examples of that. In other words, information is generated by perceivers' actions in relation to environmental structures. Now notice that's not an Enaction consistent phrase. I didn't say that structure is generated through action. What I said is structure is revealed through action, okay? Now, and again, I may be misreading the literature, and you'll have your chance to tell me that. Here's a really clear indication of this, and this is the notion of optical flow, or optic flow. When you move through the environment, remember, first of all, environments are structured, okay? We're not moving through an unstructured void. There's surfaces. As we move through the environment, what happens is we generate a flow pattern coming from the reflection of light off of surfaces, okay? And it's a very compelling flow pattern because you've all experienced it if you've been to an IMAX movie or or there's all sorts of illusions of movement where you feel yourself moving and you're not really moving. It's because the flow of optical information is information about self-movement, okay? Now, a couple of points to make about this is one, this clearly points to the fact that the information is relational. Because in the case of self-generated optical flow, as I'm moving through the world and the world flows around me, it only flows around me if I'm moving. Optic flow does not exist if I stop. The instant I stop, it goes away. So in other words, optical flow information is relational information because it only is present when the perceiver is engaging the environment, okay? And you could say, well, maybe it's an efferent copy. But in fact, as you know from the example I offered you a minute ago, you can be sitting still in a movie theater and still get compelling feelings of movement. And in fact, it's such a subtle sort of information that there's this experiment, wonderful experiment done by David Lee, where he brings people into a room. David Lee is at Edinburgh, and has them stand on a balance beam. Okay, I mean it's just a plank that's narrower than their foot length, and unbeknownst to them, the walls of the room, walls in the ceiling are independent of the floor, and it's suspended on a crane. So what David and his colleagues do is shift the walls just a little bit one way or the other, almost imperceptibly. And what happens, well, you kind of imagine it. So you're standing on a balance beam, and the walls just shift just a little bit this way. What do you think happens? The person falls forward. Shift it the other way, the person falls backwards. Because what he's doing by shifting the walls is generating optic flow, and optic flow is information about self-movement. Now, in this case, he's producing the change, but normally, and again, this is the important point, we are producing the information. Now, we're not producing the information in our heads. We're generating the information through our interaction with the world. Yeah?
Just on that point of clarification, I think it's probably a good idea if you explain your term information, because it's...
Yeah, information, what I mean by that is a characteristic of let's say the light or the sound, the array of it, which specifies some feature of the environment. Okay, so in this case, if I'm looking, let's say I'm manipulating the object in my hand, the information is that which is invariant, the environment that I discover as I manipulate the object. Okay, so information specifies properties of the environment. Why is that important? Well, go back to one of my earliest claims, that perceiving is a function that enables organisms to engage their environment. You want to be able to perceive the environment that you're moving around in. You want to be able to perceive resources and hazards and so on. And so what you're doing is detecting properties that specify these distal surfaces. And these properties are, I can elaborate on this, are somewhat ambiguous in a stationary array, but they're not in a moving array.
Very much not computational information.
No, it's got nothing to do with computation. In fact, I haven't talked about anything going on in the head. I'm talking about the organism-environment interaction. Ezekiel?
I fully understand, I think, the main point that you're trying to give, but you know, the importance of moving the ways of relating and somehow connecting to these invariant structures. But I'm very confused with the language that you use sometimes, because I mean, sometimes you say that things are revealed through transformations, as if I am, you know, the discoverer of something that is out there. And just now you said that through self-movement we're producing information. And I know that, you know, information in this sense is meant to be relational, so that, but the terminology sometimes seems to imply that actually it's something that is out there, and I am actually the discoverer of something that is out there, as opposed to something that is actually produced in that interaction.
These are really hard issues, but what I'm trying, and I want to come back to talking about independent, the notion of independent versus relational later. But what I want to say is that the information is revealed in the organism-environment interaction, but the information, the invariant, is a potential property given a moving perceiver. So in a sense, we have to get away from the notion of there's an environment that's independent of us, you know, that is this, but we also, and what I worry about is the other move of talking about the environment that we experience in our heads. I think the danger for the ecological psychologist is being read as saying that the information is in the world independent of the organism. That isn't true. But I think that the reciprocal danger of the inaction position is being read that everything's going on in the head. And we need to, where we need to converge is a clear sense of what we mean by relational. So we'll have that conversation. Let me see what comes next. Oh yeah, so this is just since I don't have a movie, this is give you a sense of what optical flow fields look like. And again, you readily use this information. Just think about if you're driving, how you maintain a constant distance between the car in front of you. You could, I suppose, do a complex calculation. But all you need to do, if you want to maintain a constant distance from the car in front of you, is just to keep the size of the object constant, of the object in front of you. If it starts to get bigger, you're getting closer. If it starts to get smaller, you're moving away. So you kind of adjust your movement in order to achieve that goal. Again, and this gets back to Ezekiel's point, I want to say that optical flow environmental information is relational. It emerges from an organism-environment interaction, but that needs some clarification, I realize. But let me, just on that point, I don't want to be accused of cherry picking, but I looked through the inaction literature a bit to see where Gibson is referred to. And this is one point, and I think it points out how Gibson's misunderstood. Although Gibson's not mentioned in this quotation, this statement is in the context of talking about ecological psychology. And there's parts of this that I would agree with, and parts of it I don't. So for the inactivist, sense, I haven't identified the source, and I could if you want. But for the inactivist, sense is not an invariance present in the environment. Well, from an ecological point of view, I don't even know what that means. Okay, because we're not even talking about senses. We're talking about invariants that emerge in organism-environment relationships. And certainly they're not retrieved. They're detected. Okay, it's not like we're fishing out there in the world, but they emerge from the dynamic interaction. The second sentence I agree with, except the word dialogue would have to be fleshed out. Invariances are instead the outcome of the dialogue between the active principles of the organism in action and the structure of the environment. I'm good with that, although we'd have to make sure we both agree about what we mean by dialogue. But then the next sentence gets us back into some dicey territory. The finding of meaning must be enacted. It is always a formative activity. Well, that's where we might disagree, because I want to say that the discovery of structure is not about the extraction of information, but really the discovery of information. Extraction suggests that it's out there and we're just sort of pulling it out. By moving around, we're actually creating structure. Yeah?
Point of clarification, because I know you're going to talk a lot about sensation and perception.
Yeah.
The word sense in the first sentence there does not mean sensation.
What does it mean?
Meaning. Right? Unless I'm thoroughly mistaken, the word sense there has nothing to do with sensation. It has to do with sense making. The extraction of meaning, that's why it comes back to defining
Okay.
must be enacted.
Okay, I accept that. If then that's a different intention. But I think well, I would also want to say, but we can fight about this later, that the phrase sense making is deeply problematic. I agree with of what's intended by the phrase, but I think the phrase is deeply problematic because the distinction between sensation and perception is conflated there, and I want to separate them. But that's for a few minutes from now. But thank you. If I misread that, then I apologize. But basically, the sentiment of organisms passively receiving information is just not an ecological claim. And I want to say that the notion of the phrase "the world is brought forth" or "the world is enacted," I think is deeply problematic for reasons which I'll come to, and I'm sure I'm annoying many of you by saying that. Let me try to illustrate a few of these points with some research, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm a psychologist, so I have to have some bona fides as someone who does data collection. Okay, so what prompted this research essentially I mean, I come out of environmental psychology. I'm a very dissatisfied environmental psychologist. And environmental psychologists have historically said that people find their way around in the world because they have these mental representations, often called cognitive maps, which they use to guide themselves. For a bunch of reasons, that seems to be very wrong-headed, particularly if perception occurs over time. So the question I was interested in is, well, clearly people can find their way from point A to point B. Is there information in the path of locomotion that they utilize in finding their way? And I just wanted to get a start on this question. So let me introduce two terms, first of all, and these are from Gibson. The first term is Vista, and essentially he defines Vista as, you know, that which can be seen from here. In other words, if from a given observation point, all that you can see. The second term is transition, and a transition is when you are essentially moving from one vista to another. So in the course of moving through a transition, you're leaving one vista and opening up a new one. And let me see, yeah, okay. And so what I want to say here is that the hypothesis is that what's critical in finding your way is learning a path in terms of a sequence of transitions. And again, a transition is the revealing of a new vista and if you will, an exiting of the prior one. And I can elaborate on that a little bit, but let me just say that what's important about a transition is that it's generated, again, through action. So if you imagine yourself walking, although the reflection is making it hard to see, if you imagine yourself walking, let's say, around this bend in the road, you can stop transition information by just stopping walking, okay? In other words, it's the kind of relational information akin to optical flow information. It's self-generated, but it's generated in relationship to environmental structures. If you don't have an arrangement of vistas, or maybe put it simply, if you don't have, let's say, a surface occluding another surface, when you move, you know, the more the surface behind is revealed or concealed, but that's a function of your movement. But the occlusion is there in the world. This bend in the road is in the road, okay? So the experiment, quite simply, and this is busy and maybe impossible to see, first of all, what you have to do is take this and put it up here. This is a continuous time record. I should have tried to print it in landscape, but I'm primitive. And what's happening is the perceiver, a videotape of a 20-minute walk through a complex environment was created. And then participants in a laboratory were just asked to watch it and just to press a key on the computer when they saw something that was useful for finding their way. Okay. So basically, the film is playing. This, you can't see, is time. This is the number of responses, okay? And what you can see on first viewing, it's a bit all over the place. There's some responses in certain places that are more like, that are clustered more than others. If you can see these brackets, is that possible from the back? Yeah, sorry about that. Well, this bracket, there's brackets here. What those brackets are independent judges identified where the transitions were in the route. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is see where the responses are relative to the transitions in the route. The transitions are defined independently of the perceivers by some judges, and we're just asking people to press the bar key, the space bar. Now, this is on first viewing, but this is the record on second viewing. After they've seen it once, and now they're going through it a second time, and we give them the same instructions. You know, press the space bar at points that'll be useful for wayfinding. And what you can see in the change is, first of all, the variability gets greatly reduced, but also the responses, with a few exceptions, cluster at the transitions. In other words, to put it in the language I used a minute ago, is that in traveling through the environment, they've detected information which it's useful for them to find their way, and that information happens to be transitional information, which is self-generated in relationship to the environment. Okay? It's relational information that's critical. And so it's analogous to the notion of an invariant specifying an object. Through movement, we detect relational moving an object, or moving with respect to an object, we detect the structure of the object. But the structure is revealed as we move with regard to it. Similarly, the structure of a path of locomotion is discovered as you move through it. Oops, wrong key. I think it's better to work on your own computer, but so be it. Okay, so my point here is that critical for finding one's way are transitions. And just as in terms of a design point of view, because designers are interested in these questions, as you know, not all transitions are equally distinctive as others. I don't know about in your country, but in the US, I mean, hospitals are notoriously confusing for finding your way because every hallway, every turn looks like the last one. But if the transitions are distinctive, okay, if the new information that appears at the turn is distinctive each time, then wayfinding orientation is far easier. And this is where this kind of work can dovetail with design questions. And as my students will tell you, I say everything many, many times. Again, this information, transitional information, is generated through action. It's not in the environment per se, but it arises from the environment through action because of the way that the surfaces are established in the environment. Okay, so summarizing what I just said, I guess I don't need to go through all this. This is mostly as a point of to show a break in the flow. Now, let me contrast this view of perceiving with the standard view of perceiving. And the standard view of perceiving is that of assuming that vision works as if we're perceiving pictures. This notion goes back to the idea that you're assuming that vision is based on the projection of an image on the retina. Okay? It has a very old pedigree. It goes back at least as far as Kepler, who writes, "I say there is vision when a representation of the whole hemisphere of the world that is before the eye, and a bit more, fixes itself on, essentially, the retina." Theories in visual perception continue to claim that vision begins with a retinal image. Even some people in the ecological camp will use that phrase, and I really don't like that. And one of the reasons is because a retinal image is basically static, and it's flat. And the world that we experience is neither of those things. Okay, so let me just continue. And certainly this view becomes pretty central in Western culture, particularly in the development of representational art through people like Da Vinci and others quite early, really brought into becoming a major idea with the work of people like Vermeer and the development of a camera obscura, which plays a critical role in the development of representational painting. Okay. But the question is this the way vision works? And it suggests that the first step in vision is static, an image on the perceiver. And that results in a sensation-perception distinction. This first level is essentially sensation, which presumably is impoverished or limited. As I'll show at the end of my talk, Noe talks about it as perspectival views. Yeah?
Can you just quickly say why you say it's static? In what sense is the right way to static?
Yeah, because, well, for the simple reason, I mean, you're certainly right that there's movement on the retina, but notice that if you go back, if you think about just photography, I mean, one of the first things you have to learn, if you're a child, is not to move the camera because the image blurs.
You take a moment in time and make it static in that moment, but that applies to anything.
But you're right, except that to get a clear image, you need a moment of non-movement. Your shutter will take care of that. But let me continue. But our experience is of a continuous world. So how do we explain that? The typical view is that the brain is sent these static images that then get assembled. Okay? Yeah?
That's actually very strange because in order to sample something, you need to decide on a window in which you say, and within this period we assume something is static or something like that, and we file it.
I don't dispute that at all. I'm just giving you the standard line. I'm not defending this position.
No, but I don't think that anyone is defending this position because it's so ridiculous. It's more that they are reducing themselves to the study of static pictures or something like that.
But if you look at, I'm serious, if you look at most accounts of visual perception in psychology today, the first step is going to be a momentary slice of information that's frozen in time, a saccade. And so if we're picking up these momentary slices, we have to assemble them to perceive a dynamic world. However, if we're not detecting static slices, if we're detecting information over time continuously, we've created a false problem, if you see what I'm saying. And so the traditional approach, and I'm mentioning this because I think there's some dangers of this in action theory, is to create this distinction between sort of the input, which is somehow limited relative to the experience, and some subsequent action of the organism which essentially produces the full-blown experience. You understand what I'm saying there? There's sort of a first step which is somewhat impoverished relative to the experience, like seeing an object from a certain perspective. And there's the experience of seeing the object, in the full. That distinction is only warranted if, in fact, this description of sensation is valid. But now I'm trying to show you that from a cultural, historical point of view, the notion of a static image doesn't come out of the study of vision, it comes out of the study of representational art and was incorporated into vision. People, I'll come to this person in a minute. Oh, but let me just elaborate. So typically the stories you get in the mainstream psychological theory, and this comes out of the major figure in all this is Helmholtz, 19th century theorist Helmholtz, is that so what happens in perceiving is that you first get some partial cues, and then they need to be assembled or integrated. Helmholtz said you make an inference based on partial cues. So the difference between sensation and perception is that sensation are these somewhat reduced information. Let me say, properties that do not fully account for the experience of the environment, but only partially. And then we need to enrich that, elaborate that. Or another way of saying that, and this is when I'll come back to the enaction view of perception, is that that perspectival views of objects need to be converted into experience of the object by the perceiver. And I'm going to dispute that. But that'll be clear at the very end. But what this leads to is a position that none of us in the room want to be in, which is this position here. Because if the early stages of, in this case, vision, are somewhat impoverished, and the organism has to therefore assemble these various impoverished pieces of information to experience the world, what you have is an experience separated from the world, and we don't want to be there. By the way, this comes, if you'll notice, figure 1-2, this comes from chapter 1 of a book on perception, undergraduate textbook. This is essentially telling students, here's how vision works, okay? Descartes could have written this textbook, right? And it's not, by the way, a quirky one. This is a mainstream, I mean, it's Goldstein's Sensation of Perception. It's one of the biggest selling perception books in the United States.
Which is, by the way, very interesting. It's called sensation and perception, and in the index, the word sensation doesn't occur once.
Huh, interesting, interesting. And that doesn't surprise me, but the entire account of perception, although he's in various editions, he's giving more and more space to ecological theory. But the entire account of visual perception is based on the assumption that there's a difference between sensation and perception, and that sensation is the first step. And what Gibson wants to argue, as I'll hope to make clear a little bit, is that sensation has nothing to do with perception, because sensation doesn't carry any information. And so we get to this position, which you all probably are quite familiar with, starting with Locke. It's evident the mind knows things not immediately, but only by the intervention of ideas, or dare I say, sensory motor coordinations. It has of them. That was probably a cheap shot, but okay. But I'm trying to set up the argument for later. Our knowledge is therefore real only insofar as there is a conformity between our ideas in our heads and the reality out there. We're creating two worlds. And as Fred's been saying for the last couple of days, I gather none of us want to create two worlds. Okay. Whereas what Gibson writes, and it limits perceiving to the now. Gibson argues that traditional theories of perception take it for granted that what we see now, present experience, is the sensory basis of our perception of the environment. That's just restating what I just said. Traditional theories assume that what we see now is the sensory basis of perception, but he says that the perceptual process does not begin with this momentary pattern. Perceiving begins with the pickup of invariance over time. Perceiving is a process that occurs over time. Sorry for the monologue, but I want to lay these things out. In a minute, I'll shift to some other things which are more my contributions. One of the things that the cognitivists hate about Gibson, although I think this doesn't bother many of you so much, is they'll say, but that means that memory doesn't play a role in perceiving. But if perceiving occurs over time, memory doesn't necessarily play the standard role that it does in visual perception. He writes, the theory of information pickup does not need memory. It does not have to have as a basic postulate the effect of past experience on a present way by experience by way of memory. It does, however, and this relates to skill, need to explain learning. That is, the improvement of practice, of perceiving with practice, and the education of attention. The state of a perceptual system is altered when it is attuned to information of a certain sort. The system has then become sensitized. Differences are noticed that were not previously noticed. Features become distinctive that were formerly vague.
So you're the judge of whether this should be a question for later. But with the memory, how do you explain the baby experience of the rotation without some sort of like memory placeholder? That's not a skill, that is a placeholder of, there's an object in my present environment that looks something like this.
Yeah. The problem here is the problem with the word memory, because it means different things. If you mean the effects of sort of prior exposure cumulatively on the present, sure. You can't discount your history. If you mean that there's this memory trace in your head that you therefore use to enrich the momentary sensory pattern, Gibson's going to say no. And that latter point is what the standard claim, the cognitivist claim about perception is. So he's attacking the cognitivists here. The cognitivist use of memory and theories of perception. And so as I want to say what's happening, and Gibson doesn't develop this too far, is that in the course of an individual's lifetime, there's ongoing attunement. So at any given moment, you bring a history of perceptual attunements, sensitivities, if you will, to the situation. And I think that's part of what we mean by being skilled, except in that case, we're talking more about perception action processes. All right, let me move ahead in just a second. But just to reinforce something, so the received view, the traditional view, draws a distinction between sensation and perception. Sensations are sort of impoverished input. Perception is the full awareness of the environment. Perception of the environment is indirect because you experience the environment in terms of the perception that you've created rather than the detection of the properties of the environment immediately. And what it leads to is mediation theories and enrichment theories. The debate I want to have with some of you maybe later is whether Noe and O'Regan's theory is a mediation theory. I'm inclined to think that it is, but I might be wrong. Okay, well, let's move on. Here's now for something completely different. Sorry? If you imagine that you're an 8-year-old child and out in the field, what do you experience there? Yeah. I mean, I would assume for many of you, it's like I'm on that tree right away, right? It's a tree that affords climbing. Now, why does it afford climbing? Let's go back to the previous photo. What makes it a climbable tree? It's not hard to start enumerating the reasons, right? The trunk's low to the ground, blah, 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 we can name it. And so, in fact, we can talk about trees as a category of objects, but trees differ in their affordances. This is not a climbable tree, although, you can climb it. And I certainly have done it as a kid. It's not fun, and it tends to be really messy. That is not a particularly climbable tree for a human being. It affords climbing to some extent. That affords climbing, that doesn't. In other words, what the point I'm trying to make here is that we can distinguish objects that might fall in the same, let's say, abstract category, the same concept, but we can distinguish them in terms of their affordance properties. Okay, so not only are do trees afford climbing, but you can name all kinds of things that afford climbing in a child's environment, right? So what is it that makes something climbable? Well, among other things, it has to be properly scaled to your body. You have to be able to reach, the ledge or the surface and so on. So notice that what makes it climbable is its relationship to you. So, and let's take the notion of a sittable surface. What affords sitting on is relative to the perceiver. This is a wall in front of the student union at my college, which begins very low at one point and keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And I just had my two friends, Phil and Joe, kind of occupy two positions on this wall. And you can see, although I'm forcing the point, Phil could sit on this, but not comfortably. It readily affords sitting for Joe. At this point, it readily affords sitting for Phil, but it's the same wall. In other words, given the different sizes relative to the perceiver, the affordance changes. And in this case, I'm perfectly happy to say we're talking about embodied properties of the environment. We're describing the environment with respect to the body. Okay? Some data. Hopefully, many of you know this work. This is Bill Warren's classic experiment on affordances. And the results are very revealing. So what you have here is an experiment where people are asked to judge whether they can step up on a step, on a riser. Okay? And what the experimenter can do is vary the riser height. Okay? So the distance between the two step surfaces can be very small, it can be really big. We've experienced steps that vary in that way. So all the perceivers are asked to do is just say yes or no, the step is climbable. And he gets participants who are short legs, participants who have long legs, asks them to make these judgments, and this line is the 50%. In other words, when participants are saying half of the time that they can climb the step. And not surprisingly, the shorter participants are saying yes 50% of the time at a lower riser height than the tall participants. Okay. Right. So what? What's really cool is then instead of, let me go back to the previous slide, instead of using the height of the riser as our metric, let's use a body scaled measure. In this case, riser height relative to leg length. If you take the height of the riser and divide it into the person's leg length, you get a ratio, and a ratio is, this is a ratio of the body-environment relationship. If you then convert the abscissa to a pi value, that is to say, to a relational value, they meet. And what does that say? What it says is that they are perceiving relational information that affords stepping up on a surface. Okay? This experiment has been replicated with a lot of different kinds of materials since then. This was published in '87. What I think is important about this, I think it's a fairly convincing demonstration, as have been the subsequent experiments, that information is relational. Okay? That is to say, the perceivers, regardless of their height, are perceiving relational information that affords stepping up on. Well, I hesitate. I won't go there. Another experiment which I find really very interesting, it's kind of related to this. And this is an experiment by Len Mark at the Miami University of Ohio. And he's having people judge whether a seat affords sitting on. And it's a stool that can be cranked up and cranked down. Okay, so you can vary the height of the seat. And you're asking people, can you sit on it? And here's the 50, basically here's the 0, and it's scaled differently here, but it's the perceived versus compared to the actual height. And you can see that people are overestimating, but not by very much. They're relatively accurate in judging whether a particular seat height will afford sitting on. The overestimates are an interesting side issue, which we could come back to. So these are subsequent trials. And this is, if a person was judging the height of the seat relative to their height as being the same, then their score would be 0. So this would be an underestimate. This would be an overestimate. So they're slightly overestimating the height of the seat. But that's not the important point. Now, what he does in this experiment, though, is he does the same thing again, but he puts blocks on people's shoes that elevates their height by a number of inches. And what you see, not surprisingly, is now they're underestimating. Okay, but the important point is, well, what happens? So what have they learned in this experiment so far? Have they learned sort of the absolute height of the seat? Or are they learning body-scaled information? So what happens in the rest of the experiment? In this case, the individuals are just standing still, looking at the seat. In this case, they're allowed to move. And so you can see that generally the pattern of overestimates still obtains. But roughly, these are pretty accurate judgments. We're talking about minimal differences. I mean, these are centimeters. But what's the most interesting point of these data are these guys here, the ones wearing blocks on their shoes, and that in fact, as they move, they recalibrate their judgments. Okay? So movement enables them to recalibrate what affords sitting on and what doesn't. It's a dynamic process. Hopefully that's the end of that. Okay, now let's push this a little further. Is affordance judgment body scaled? Everything I've said up to now suggests the answer is yes. But a new line of research is largely by Dennis Profit and his students is pushing the boundaries a little more. Let's say we have an experiment here And we want to know, does altering body mass by wearing a backpack affect your perception of environmental properties? Now, what does that mean? If you're wearing a backpack, what we're thinking is that it changes your relationship to the environment. And if environments are perceived relationally, you ought to perceive them differently. And so in Prophet's experiment, he has people wearing backpacks, not necessarily with babies in them, weighted backpacks. And he asks them to judge the slope of a hill. In one case, a 5-degree slope, in another case, a 31-degree slope. These are the judgments with no backpacks. These are the judgments with backpacks. Okay. There wasn't, he had a haptic measure. It was just sort of using a board to kind of tilt to make a judgment. That didn't show the effect. But visual and verbal reports showed that if your body mass is increased, the slope of the hill seems more severe, both with 5 and 31-degree slopes. This has been replicated in lots of ways. Here's one replication where people are judging distance, not slope. This is judgment of distance, estimated distance to actual distance without a backpack. And you see a fairly accurate pattern, although again, what's peculiar in this work is you get these under and over estimates, which we could talk about later. The most important point, though, is the relative differences. You're wearing a heavier backpack, your body mass is increased, distances seem farther. Okay. Does that mean, therefore, you're perceiving the world subjectively? No. It means you're perceiving the world in relationship to your body. Okay. Does it mean you're perceiving the world independent of your body, as sometimes Gibsonians are accused of saying? Of course not. This precisely reinforces the Gibsonian point that you're perceiving the world relationally. So it's not mere body scaling, but action possibilities. I want to say that affordances, if you'd like a definition that I wrote at 6 a.m. this morning, so I might backtrack a little bit. Affordances are action possibilities of the environment taken with respect to an individual. Gibson emphasizes that they're neither objective nor subjective. You can say they're both, or we'd rather say they're neither. That the objective-subjective dichotomy is really not helpful at all in psychology. And Fred's been making that point over the last few days. Rather than being objective or subjective, it's properties of an organism-environment relationship. And in doing that, what we're adopting is a psychological level of analysis when we're adopting a relational view, rather than a physical or a mental, I say a physical analysis. When we adopt a psychological level of analysis, we're talking, among other things, about functional properties relative to the perceiver, in this case, affordances. Okay. End of part 1, but that was most of the talk. Let me tell you about the ways in which I've tried to push these ideas a little bit. And it has to do with the way in which evolutionary biologists have been thinking about adaptation. Even though, and here I'll just make a snide remark, even though evolutionary psychologists haven't figured this out yet, evolutionary biology talks about adaptation in a way that psychologists often don't. The standard way of talking about adaptation comes out of Herbert Spencer in the 19th century, and it's the notion that an animal adjusts to the environment. Spencer put it, the adjustment of inner to outer. In the 1850s, William James wrote a devastating essay on this, trying to indicate why this is so wrong-headed. But let me just take a simple approach to this. Instead, we want to say that adaptation not only involves organisms adjusting, but also changing their environment to better fit with it. It involves an organism-environment reciprocity. And if you start looking for evidence of this, it's all over the place. There's a great book, if you haven't read it, called Niche Construction, that was published about 10 years ago, which is all about the ways in which organisms, from microorganisms to humans, alter their environment to better live in it. And here's just a few examples. I don't know if beavers are native to this part of the world, but this is a beaver dam. This is constructed as a lodge for beavers to live with their families and raise their young and so on. And it's assembled by creating these nests. Spider webs are another example of niche construction. In the case of beaver dams, they might last for several months. In the case of a spider's web, it might last for a matter of hours. Termite hills. This one is a particularly interesting one, and Fred mentioned leafcutter ants. What these chaps do is not only do they create these huge underground spaces to live in, but they also transport leaves in to create essentially agriculture within their nest. In other words, they produce their own food supply. Now, what I'm trying to say then is that it isn't that the organisms are merely adjusting to the environment, but we're also changing the environment to better adjust to it. This is this ongoing cycle of niche construction. And these are bowerbird nests, these huge nests, and here's these strange creatures, building, changing their environment to better support their activities in the woods. Niche construction is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's with all species, and humans have developed it to a high art. What are we doing when we're engaging in niche construction? We're creating new affordances. We're creating properties that support action relative to the individual. And a great deal of we could look at a sort of a major slice of cultural evolution as niche construction. We're completely in an artificial setting right now in some ways. Artificial, not in the sense that it isn't made up of, there's probably some organic fibers here or something, right? But it's artificial in the sense that we've created it in order to better carry out what we hope to do in here. And so, just to make this part short, so these niche construction and generally sociocultural influences are collective and cumulative, and as is well known, especially in many much European thinking, that each of us is then born into an environment that is already structured by sociocultural activities. In other words, so if these activities produce create affordances, then each of us are born into an environment that's filled with affordances, some of which are wholly produced by human activity. So this is another misunderstanding of affordances. Affordances is often thought to be, they're just natural. But that's a red herring. The natural social distinction is phony. Human activity produces affordances. It creates affordances out of natural materials. There is no distinction between the two. In fact, what I want to argue, but I won't do it here, but hopefully in another future paper, is although we often talk about social affordances, what I want to say is that affordances, by and large, for humans, are social because we make them. We create our environments. And these are not environments in our head, they're real environments that we live in. Virtually every object in this room has an affordance property that's been created to support activity. And as children, or if you're new to a culture, you have to engage the environment in order to somehow discover those properties. Fred, do you have a point?
No,
okay. And so, as I said, each of us is born into an environment that's filled with affordance structures. I'm not talking about meaning here, because that'll just send us down a road, but I'm happy to do that subsequently. And they're very different kinds of environments. I sort of use these pictures to contrast this one with these two as the very different kinds of worlds that children enter into that are structured to varying degrees, have different types of affordances. The environments provide different tools for children to engage. So here's a young child manipulating a book, even though the child isn't yet at reading age, presumably. So the child is familiar with the book. Here's a much discussed photograph that you would never see in most Western cultures of a barely walking baby holding a machete. But in this particular culture, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And even we get rather carried away sometimes in our environments. Okay, now let me take one last step. What I've been doing so far is I said that what I want to talk about is everything else, namely the environment, okay? And that's, I've been trying to fill in the everything else with affordances that are present due to natural circumstances, but also designed and modified by humans. But there's another set of environmental structures that is greatly neglected, and so, and this is the work of Roger Barker. Roger Barker is a psychologist. If you haven't heard of him, you're in good company, because in fact, many psychologists trained today have never heard of him, and yet he's someone in the 60s who won like the highest award that APA gives. Okay, I mean, in his day, he was incredibly distinguished. And let me talk about what he did. What prompted Barker's work is a very interesting experience. At about mid-career, when he was fairly well known, all of his prior work had been developmental studies. He was a postdoc of Levine. He co-published with Kurt Levine, and was a very, very well-known developmental psychologist. Anyway, Barker reports in his memoirs that one day he was riding on a train through these small towns in Illinois, and he realized that even though at this moment he probably knew as much about developmental psychology as most people, I mean, he was up to date with the literature, he had no idea what was going on in any of these small towns. He couldn't predict a thing about what these kids were doing. He was recognizing, in fact, that what we don't know is what happens in everyday life. So he did what biologists have long done, and he preceded Jane Goodall by a good decade and a half, established a research station in the small town and began studying behavior. Okay. Now, I'll have to make a long story short, but one of the most interesting things that comes out of this research, and it's not anything he expected, it really surprised him, and I'll can try to tell you why, is that he identified that there are higher order, and by that I mean collectively generated, and by that I mean generated by multiple people, structures in the environment that create opportunities for our lives. And so let me get right to the point, and I'm going to be really brief on this because time is short. He calls these environmental structures, these higher order structures, behavior settings. I'll get to more precise in just a minute. Behavior settings are dynamic, relatively stable, time-limited ecological entities. And the easiest way to explain a behavior setting, it's actually quite easy to explain it, you're in one. Okay. A behavior setting is a pattern of behavior. In this case, it's the behavior of someone lecturing and others attending the lecture or whatever, supported by the milieu. He called it the milieu. I'm going to say, I think affordances really fits in nicely here. By the way, the reference, if you don't know about Barker, which is at the bottom of the page. Here are the properties of behavior settings. They occur naturally as a function of the collective actions of individuals. They pop into existence. Games pop into existence. Classrooms, meetings, parades. You can kind of go on and on and on. These are collective activities, but they're structured. They're composed of a dynamic pattern of individuals and affordances. They are objective in the sense that, and this is in that this behavior setting has a specifiable geographic location. Anybody have a GPS on them? You can specify where this behavior setting is, objectively. It has a temporal boundary, started at 9:25, ends at, I'm going to shoot for 11:20. If I started before 9:30, that would have been, I would not have been in a behavior setting at the time. So there's a collective agreement about where behavior settings are and when they start and when they end. Okay, so they're relatively stable structures, but have a particular life. This issue is what I'm currently doing research on. The settings are discriminable. You know when you enter a behavior setting, and you can you know the meaning of the setting. You know what's going on at the place. That's an empirical claim which I hope to have some data for in a few months. They're quasi-stable, meaning that they respond to threats to the integrity. So let's say instead of a lecture, this is a classroom, and you have one sort of disruptive child who's threatening the integrity of the setting. Yeah, what you say, Ellen says to John, sit down, you're interrupting the class. And so that,
Leave that to the debate after.
and that sort of returns helps to restore the setting integrity. And if John still doesn't respond to Ellen, then we just bodily throw him out the door. In other words, it's a biological entity we're talking about that's collective, that operates to maintain its own stability. What I think is really cool about Barker is he's thinking at a level that most psychologists never get to. He's thinking about extra-individual environmental structures. They exist of any independent of anyone's experience, because if you step out of the room to go to the bathroom, we don't just all flop as mannequins. We're going on without you, okay? And I can say a lot more about that. What led Barker to this discovery is really pretty interesting. What he did in his work is he and his research team followed children throughout their day and basically just recorded everything that they did and the setting that they were in. And what he wanted to know is, what could I use to predict the behavior of children at any given time? The assumption, there are a couple assumptions you could make. One assumption is that if you knew about the kid's personality, you could predict what they'd be doing at any given time. Or, what Barker thought, if you knew what the child just immediately experienced, like a stimulus, you might predict what might immediately occur. None of those things turn out. It turns out that the best predictor of what a child is doing in that town at any given time is just knowing where they are. A nice way of phrasing it is that the behavior of different children in the same setting had less variability than the behavior of a single child across settings. I don't know about you, but I think this is like an incredibly cool idea, and if we don't work hard, it's going to be forgotten. Because no one's doing this work anymore. So I'll push on. So behavior settings are all over the environment. We enter them, we help generate them. They constrain our behavior, they create possibilities. We move through the environment by entering and leaving behavior settings all the time. So getting back to the everything else, what I want to say is that part of what's the everything else outside of the organism are affordances and behavior settings, generated relationally, okay? They're independent, but they're not independent. Well, that's a debatable point, obviously. So I would like to say that behavior settings and affordances constitute the ecological resources of a place from a psychological point of view. They essentially create opportunities for doing things. And we can construct them, like we call, Merrick organized this. So this behavior setting has been constructed. But it's not constructed in our heads, it's constructed in the world.
Yeah.
So if you can indulge me for another just a few minutes. It's not good practice to put maybe the most abstract part of the talk toward the very end, but I want to try to give you just a general sense of what sort of philosophical foundation all this rests on. Let me say that James's radical empiricism is not the only influence on Gibson's work. He's influenced by a lot of other ideas, including Gestalt psychology, but it's this thread which I think is particularly important because it provides grounds for his account of realism. First of all, what about the pedigree? William James developed the philosophy of radical empiricism. It's in the Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, but it's embedded in it. If you don't look for it, you won't find it. He starts developing the ideas in the 1890s, and his book, Essays in Radical Empiricism, appears in 1912 after his death. One of his students who saw himself as the standard bearer for radical empiricism in the subsequent years was Edwin Holt, and Edwin Holt was Gibson's graduate mentor. So part of what I do in the book is kind of establish that lineage. So what I want to basically say is that the kinds of relational claims that I've been making all along rest on Jamesian radical empiricism. First of all, and I am making this very brief. First of all, what does James attacking? With radical empiricism, he's attacking the entire English psychology derived from Locke and Hume and the entire German psychology from Herbarth, so far as they treat ideas as separate subjective entities in the mind that come and go. In other words, what James is rejecting is mentalism, both the British empiricist tradition and the continental tradition. Not surprisingly, folks who become deeply influenced by James's writings are Husserl and subsequently Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. So that whole alternative begins partly and just partly with James. So there are three, he lays out three principles of radical empiricism. By radical, he means that it must be an empiricism that admits into its construction, its theoretical construction. It neither admits into it anything that's not directly experienced, okay, and it doesn't exclude anything that is directly experienced. And the next point is the point that separates him from those two traditions, because, and this is the most radical part of radical empiricism, because what James claims is that what is directly experienced is not only things or objects, but the relations between them, okay? If you know a bit about Hume, I mean, the whole problem with induction with Hume is that we see these separate entities and then we make inferences from them based on contiguity of past experience. But the assumption is that those relations, the contiguous relations, are not perceived, they're inferred. That's Hume's point. And James is saying, no, they're perceived. They're in experience. And this just elaborates that point. The parts of experience hold together from next to next by relations that are themselves part of experience. So if you know, you might be familiar with James's writing about the stream of consciousness, right? And he talks about there's resting places and transition places. Does that ring a bell? Right? The transitions are the relations, although he doesn't put it that way in the principles. This terminology comes later. The directly apprehended universe needs, in short, no extraneous trans-empirical connective support. That is to say, it doesn't need sort of mental functions to connect the pieces, nor does it need a godlike force to connect the pieces. That's really what he's, as a footnote, that's what he's worried about. His major theoretical adversary at this time was idealism, which isn't really much on the scene now. And that's what he's kind of worried about here. But he wants to say it's not that God ties the connections together, but they're there in the world. Okay? So, then, what is experienced? James begins with the claim that we start with the supposition that there's only one primal stuff or material. Notice he's kind of not sure about which word he wants to use here, in the world, rather than two. In other words, we don't start with matter and mind. What we start with is experience, of which everything else is composed, and we call that pure experience. It's useful to think about it as sort of a mathematical limit. Okay, for the time being, it is unqualified actuality. It's what's there. It has a certain immediacy, and we act on it. And and the notion of an object or a subject is only virtually present in the now. It comes about by differentiating the structure of immediate experience. Everybody with me so far? Okay, because I'm going to do one more thing, but I think it's critical. This is a passage from James, and I'm going to give it to you in pieces. Okay. He says, let the reader begin with a perceptual experience, that is to say, now, the presentation, in the so-called physical object, his actual field of vision, the room he sits in. So let's begin with the room we sit in. The whole of philosophy from Democritus has been one long wrangle over the paradox that what is evidently one reality, the room we are currently situated in, can be talked about in two different ways. It can be talked about as being out there and in here. Okay. That's, from a pragmatist point of view, that is just a hopeless situation to be in. So then the question becomes the puzzle of how one identical room can be in two places, that is to say, in the outer world and in your mind, is at bottom the puzzle of how one identical point can be on two lines. And it can be if it's situated at their intersection. If it be that pure experience of the room, this sort of immediacy of our experience, this pre-reflective experience, to use a more phenomenological phrase, were a place of intersection of two processes which connected it with different groups of associates respectively. It could be counted twice over. I'll try to clarify this. Although it would remain all the time a numerical single thing. So we're experiencing something that is the conjoining of two histories, okay, that can be traced back independently of one another. But experience itself is at that moment of convergence. The experience is a member of diverse processes that can be followed away from it along entirely different lines. One of them is the reader's personal biography. In other words, all the things in your history that have, I'll use a Gibsonian phrase, that have attuned you to the possibilities of this setting. And the other is the history of the house in which the room is a part. The very same that is to say, immediate experience, is the terminus ad quem of a lot of previous physical operations like carpentering, papering, furnishing, warming, and so on. In other words, niche construction. And of a lot of future ones. As a room, the experience has occupied that spot and that environment for 30 years. So in other words, what I think he's offering us here is experience as not being separated in terms of environment and person, although that comes subsequently on reflection, but rather experience that immediately points both to the environment and the person simultaneously, like an affordance. One, I think, nice development of this idea, and hopefully Kurt Lewin is getting rediscovered, and it's really quite warranted. Lewin wouldn't describe himself as a Jamesian, but if you know about Lewin, he conceptualized behavior, and that's the term he used, as being situated in a psychological field. And so this is the person, these are the various regions of the psychological field. If he were to go on, he would talk about the valences that these might have, which might draw or repel the person to these areas. And so behavior is a function of these multiple forces. He's thinking of, and James was just at the beginning of this notice, Lewin is talking about field theory, not Newtonian physics. Okay, the Gestalt psychologists were all colleagues of Einstein. The reason I introduced Lewin is because this diagram, which I really, really like. So this is that area that I just showed you a minute ago, which is the person and the environment, combined, okay? But this is it over time. And so at this, let's say at any point along here, the character of the person is a function of its history, just as the character of the environment is a function of its history, as James said. And so experience, or in Levinian terms, the life space, is a convergence of these two histories. Gibson didn't particularly like this because it was a little too phenomenological for him, but so summary comments I won't get to. So what do I have, what's my beef with enaction theory of perception? And let me just return to this diagram here to remind you that the traditional theory, which we're all trying to get away from, draws a sensation-perception distinction. It tends to put perception in the interior of the organism, and they tend to be mediational theories. And I feel that, and I might be reading it wrong, so correct me, but I feel like the enaction theory of perception comes very close to repeating these same problems. Let me just try to show you why. Let me just show a couple passages from Noah's book. Can you not read that because of the color? Can you see that okay? No. Well, I tried to put the quotations in one color so you could separate the quotations from my comments. This quotation and the one that's on the next slide go together, so let me take them both together. Noah writes, to encounter its visual potential, and the visual potential of the object to be perceived, is to encounter its actual shape. In other words, when we encounter the potential, we perceive the actual shape. Now, where do we get the potential? When you experience an object as cubical, merely on the basis of its perspectival aspect, you do so because you bring to bear in this experience your sensory motor knowledge of the relation between changes in the cube's aspect and movement. Hopefully this is familiar. If this is unfamiliar, then not being able to read this would have been impossible to follow, I'm sure. To experience the figure as a cube on the basis of how it looks is to understand how its look changes as you move, okay? Now, what's wrong with this? Well, first of all, I think it starts to reintroduce the sensation-perception distinction. And let me show you how. Is this at all visible back there? Mm-hmm. Okay. This is the quotation again. The crux is that perspectival properties, and a perspectival property is the object seen from a particular vantage point, are not merely visible qualities such as shape and size, they are looks of things, they're visual appearances. To see a circular plate from an angle, for example, is to see something with an elliptical perspectival shape. And to understand how that perspectival shape would vary as a function of one's movements with respect to the perceived object. So in other words, you perceive the perspectival shape and you also see the virtual shape of the object because you anticipate, what would emerge if you did this, that, or the other thing. We can do this because we understand implicitly that circularity is given in the way how things look with respect to shape varies as a result of movement. Now, there's a couple of things I think are really wrong with this, and first of all, I think it's really bad phenomenology because you don't see elliptical shapes. You see circular shapes. You don't see perspectival, appearances. You perceive objects in the full. So what I'm afraid, and he probably would disagree with me, I'm sure, is what we're doing here is we're kind of slipping back into a sensation-perception mode again. And if you do that, then the sensory motor coordination that follows might lead us back into a mentalism that we don't want to get back into. Because it's all happening, as you will, off stage, instead of happening in the encounter between the organism and the environment. I'm nearly finished. Moreover, in the way this has been phrased, the idea of an invariant is missing. That is to say, if we don't detect perspectival shapes, what we detect are invariants through action, literally action, not anticipated action, not motor schemas, but by bloody moving around the world, okay? And I could sort of hammer this home. I think, but again, my experience of circularity, just as my experience of the variation in its perspectival shape, we don't perceive perspectival shape unless we're thinking about picture perception. In picture perception, we have to be very concerned about perspectival shape because we're dealing with a flat surface. I won't belabor that point, but let me take one statement that comes from Noah's book, Action and Perception, where he explicitly talks about Gibson, and I can hope to show why he's misreading Gibson. And I'm a little surprised he does, because I also know that he knows Gibson's work pretty well. So I don't quite understand what accounts for this. Gibson's view can now be usefully reformulated in the context of the inactive approach. To perceive structure is to perceive structure in the sensory motor contingencies. That is to say, in your anticipation of what something would look like if you moved in certain ways. To see that something is flat is precisely to see that it as giving rise to certain possibilities of sensory motor contingencies. And I would say, well, first of all, you don't perceive it as flat. And secondly, because what you do is you detect the invariant structure in relationship to your movements in the world. So that takes experience and puts it back at the kind of in the relationship between the organism and the environment. And what we can argue about momentarily is what I think this account does. It's a really slippery slope that heads you back into mentalism. And I don't think that, and I know that's not where you want to go. So if Gibsonian theory can offer you anything, it might be able to perhaps fine-tune that. And so this kind of phrase, just to reiterate, the ecological notion of structure is lost. What does structure mean in the context? What does structure and sensory motor contingencies mean? I have no idea. But I can tell you what structure means from an ecological point of view, because in some cases we can specify it mathematically, like in the case of the riser height relative to leg length. I can talk about it in a very concrete way. It sort of leaves open how the organism is anchored to the world. Again, it harkens back to how I started the talk. It's like there's the organism and there's everything else. That's not good enough. Everything else isn't good enough. You know, what is the everything else? And action without resistance, and this was a topic of 2 days ago, that's provided by the task structure or the environment, has no structure. Okay? So I will conclude an overlong talk at that point. Thank you.